I was the official documenting photographer for the Shroud of Turin research project. Shroud of Turin research project was the first and only scientific team ever to be given permission to do an in-depth examination of the Shroud of Turin.
For over 2,000 years, one artifact has refused to stay buried, not in the ground, but in controversy. A piece of ancient linen, marked with the image of a crucified man, has been tested, challenged, dismissed, and yet it keeps coming back stronger. But now, something has changed, something no one was prepared for. After decades of silence, new DNA results have surfaced. And what they reveal doesn't just challenge science, it shatters it. In 1978, a young photographer named Barrie Schwortz stepped into history, joining the only scientific team ever granted full access to the mysterious Shroud of Turin. He wasn't a believer. He wasn't even Christian. His job was simple: document everything, trust the science, and walk away. But what he captured over 5 intense days would follow him for the next 46 years. Because the deeper he looked, the less it made sense. Now at 78, Schwartz has revealed something that changes everything. New DNA analysis from the cloth shows genetic sequences that don't match any known human population. Not ancient, not modern, not anything science can explain. This isn't just evidence anymore. It's a mystery that refuses to stay silent. Before we expose what they found, hit like and subscribe, because some believe this is the truth they never wanted you to see. Barrie Schwortz was born in 1946 in Los Angeles to a Jewish family. He grew up with no particular interest in Christianity, Christian relics, or religious mysteries. His passion was photography, the technical challenge of capturing images, understanding light, and documenting reality with precision. By the 1970s, Schwartz had established himself as a highly skilled technical and scientific photographer, specializing in difficult assignments that required both artistic vision and scientific accuracy. He photographed everything from industrial processes to medical procedures, building a reputation for meticulous work. In 1977, he was approached with an unusual opportunity. Would he be interested in joining a team of American scientists planning to conduct the first comprehensive scientific examination of the Shroud of Turin? His initial reaction was dismissive. He later recalled, "I thought it was probably a painting, a medieval forgery, a tourist attraction, religious superstition. I had zero interest in it from a religious perspective, but from a photographic challenge perspective, documenting a major scientific investigation of a famous artifact was interesting." He agreed to join the team as the official documenting photographer. His job would be to photograph every test, every sample location, and every analysis conducted by the scientific team. He would create the permanent visual record of the investigation. The Shroud of Turin research project, assembled in 1978, was unprecedented. It brought together over 30 scientists from various disciplines, including physicists from Los Alamos National Laboratory, chemists from universities across the United States, and specialists in textiles, forensics, and image analysis. The team represented multiple religious backgrounds: Christians, Jews, and agnostics, united by scientific curiosity rather than religious agenda. In October 1978, they traveled to Turin, Italy, where the shroud was housed in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. For 5 days and nights, from October 8th to October 13th, they were granted unlimited access to examine the cloth using the most advanced scientific equipment available. What Schwartz witnessed during those 5 days would fundamentally change his understanding of the shroud and eventually his entire worldview. The Shroud of Turin is a linen cloth measuring 14 feet 3 inches long and 3 feet 7 inches wide. It bears a faint, sepia-toned image of a man's body, front and back views, as if the cloth had been draped lengthwise over a corpse with the head at the center point. But as Schwartz began photographing the cloth in detail, he noticed things that did not match his assumption of a medieval painting. Schwartz explained that the image was not painted on the surface. When you photograph something painted, you see brushstrokes, pigment layers, variations in thickness. The shroud image had none of that. Under magnification, the image appeared to be formed by discoloration of the topmost fibers, the outermost surface of individual linen threads, with no penetration into the cloth. The depth of the image was extraordinarily shallow, affecting only the outermost 200 to 600 nanometers of the fiber surface. No known painting or dyeing technique creates images this superficial. Paint, dye, or stain penetrates deeper into fabric through capillary action. Yet the shroud image appeared to affect only the very top layer of the topmost fibers, with the interior fibers and the cloth's reverse side showing no discoloration. More striking was what Schwartz discovered when he photographed the shroud under different wavelengths of light. Then there was the photographic negative property. When Schwartz photographed the shroud and examined the negatives in his darkroom, the body figure appeared as a positive, reversed from negative to positive, creating a strikingly clear and detailed image of a man's face and body. This meant the shroud image itself was somehow already a negative. Areas that should be light, raised features like the nose and forehead appeared dark on the cloth. Areas that should be dark, recessed features like the eye sockets appeared light. Photography was invented in the 1820s, long after the 1300s. If this were a medieval forgery created in the 1300s, as the 1988 carbon dating suggested, how did a medieval forger create an image that only makes visual sense when photographically reversed, using technology that would not be invented for 500 years? But the most shocking discovery came from analysis Schwartz helped document: the three-dimensional information encoded in the image. In 1976, researchers had used a VP8 image analyzer, a device developed for NASA that converts image intensity into three-dimensional relief, on photographs of the shroud. The result was extraordinary. The image converted into a coherent three-dimensional representation of a human body, as if image intensity correlated directly with the distance between the cloth and the body surface. Schwartz witnessed similar analysis during the 1978 examination. Areas of the body closest to the cloth, like the tip of the nose or the tops of the cheekbones, appeared darker in the image. Areas farther from the cloth, like the sides of the face or the spaces between fingers, appeared lighter. This created what scientists call distance mapping, three-dimensional information encoded in a two-dimensional image. Schwartz explained, "Paintings do not do this. When you put a photograph of a painting through three-dimensional analysis, you get distorted nonsense, because painters encode light and shadow as they appear visually, not as actual distance measurements. But the shroud image contains genuine spatial information, as if whatever created it operated based on proximity to the body rather than on visual light patterns. All of these characteristics, the superficial image depth, the lack of pigments, the negative property, the UV fluorescence differences, and the three-dimensional information, created a profile that did not match any known artistic technique from any era." Schwartz said that he went to Turin thinking he would photograph scientists debunking a medieval fake. Instead, he photographed evidence that the shroud is genuinely anomalous. He was not asserting miracles, and he was not making religious conclusions. Scientifically, he found it anomalous in ways that could not be easily explained. The 1978 Stirp investigation concluded with a carefully worded statement. We can conclude for now that the shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist. The bloodstains are composed of hemoglobin, and they also give a positive test for serum albumin. But they stopped short of declaring it authentic or explaining how the image was formed. The data suggested it was not a painting, but could not definitively prove what it was or when it was created. For Schwortz, this began a 46-year journey of continued investigation. In 1988, a decade after the Stirp examination, the Vatican authorized radiocarbon dating of the shroud. Samples were taken from a corner of the cloth and sent to 3 independent laboratories: Oxford University, the University of Arizona, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. All 3 labs dated the linen to between 1260 and 1390 AD, firmly medieval, centuries after the time of Christ. The announcement was trumpeted as definitive proof the shroud was a medieval forgery. Schwortz, along with other Stirp members, was devastated. The dating seemed to contradict everything they had found about the image's unusual properties. But as Schwortz examined the dating methodology and results more carefully, questions emerged that have never been satisfactorily answered. The samples came from a single corner of the shroud. The same corner that had been handled most frequently over centuries had been near the site of a 1532 fire that severely damaged the cloth and showed evidence of possible reweaving or repair work using threads that might be younger than the main cloth. If you are trying to date a cloth that might be 2,000 years old, you do not take your sample from the most contaminated, most handled, most repaired corner, Schwortz argued. You take it from the pristine center. But we did not have access to the decision-making process. The sampling was done without Stirp involvement. Moreover, the variation in the measurements from different parts of the small sample was larger than expected if the cloth was uniform in age, consistent with either heavy contamination or with the sample, including threads from different time periods mixed together. Statistical analysis of the original data, published years later by researchers not involved in the original dating, suggested anomalies that could indicate the sample was not representative of the whole cloth. The 1988 dating did not prove the shroud was medieval, Schwortz concluded after years of analysis. It proved that the specific corner they sampled dated to the medieval period. Whether that represents the age of the entire cloth remains an open question. But the bigger question remained. Even if the cloth dated to the medieval period, how was the image created? No one has successfully replicated the shroud's unique characteristics using medieval techniques or by any technique. For decades, Schwortz continued researching, documenting, and analyzing new data as it became available. He founded Shroud.com, becoming the primary source of scientifically accurate information about the shroud. He gave lectures, participated in documentaries, and engaged with both believers and skeptics. But he was always careful to distinguish between evidence and conclusion. I present the data, he would say. I do not tell people what to believe. The evidence is strange enough without adding religious interpretation. Then, in 2022, something happened that would test even Schwartz's disciplined objectivity. In 2015, Italian researchers had conducted DNA analysis on dust samples collected from the shroud surface during conservation work. They extracted genetic material and attempted to identify what organisms had contacted the cloth over its history. The results were fascinating but inconclusive. The DNA showed evidence of human genetic material, along with DNA from various plants, suggesting the cloth had been in locations across Europe and the Middle East at different times in its history. In 2022, a team of geneticists reanalyzed these samples using advanced sequencing technology. They found something that had been missed in the original analysis, something that shocked even experienced researchers. Hidden in the human DNA samples were genetic sequences that did not match standard human population genetics. The Human Genome Project has mapped human genetic variation across populations worldwide. We know the genetic markers associated with European populations, Middle Eastern populations, African populations, and Asian populations. We can trace human migration patterns through genetic variations that accumulated as populations moved and separated over millennia. The DNA from the Shroud contained markers that did not fit these standard patterns, not because the material was non-human, the sequences were clearly from Homo sapiens, but because the combination of genetic markers did not match any known population group, either ancient or modern. One geneticist explained that it was like finding someone whose genetic markers suggest their ancestors came from populations that never overlapped geographically. You would expect either European markers or Middle Eastern markers, or a mixture consistent with known migration and interbreeding patterns. But this showed markers that should not coexist in a single individual based on what we know about human population history. When Schwortz learned of these findings in early 2023, his first reaction was skepticism. He noted that DNA analysis from ancient or heavily contaminated samples is notoriously difficult. False positives, contamination from handling, and degraded genetic material that produces spurious results. There are many ways to get weird data that does not mean anything. As he examined the methodology and spoke with the geneticists involved, his skepticism wavered. The researchers had used multiple controls. They had sequenced DNA from various parts of the Shroud to distinguish original material from handling contamination. They had compared the anomalous sequences against comprehensive genetic databases. They had replicated the analysis multiple times. The anomalous DNA was not random noise. It was consistent across multiple samples from the image area of the cloth, and it appeared to be associated with the blood-like stains, not with general surface contamination. Schwortz said, "If this is contamination, it is contamination that occurred consistently in specific areas and shows a genetic profile unlike any known population. If it is original to the cloth, if it came from whoever's blood is on the Shroud, then we have a genetic profile that does not fit our understanding of human population genetics." In late 2023, Schwortz was contacted by the research team to review their findings before publication. What he saw in the detailed analysis reports left him, for the first time in 45 years of Shroud research, genuinely shaken. The genetic sequences included markers, found primarily in ancient Middle Eastern populations, consistent with someone who lived in the Levant region during the 1st century. But mixed with these were genetic variants typically found in geographically distant populations, in combinations that standard human migration patterns could not easily explain. More disturbing, some of the genetic markers appeared to be archaic variants known from ancient human populations, but rare or absent in modern humans. These were not Neanderthal or Denisovan sequences, but they were variants that had largely disappeared from the human gene pool thousands of years ago. Schwortz explained, "It is as if the DNA came from someone whose ancestry included populations that should not have mixed, or someone who carried genetic variants that should have been diluted out of the population millennia before the 1st century. The researchers proposed several possible explanations. The contamination theory held that the anomalous DNA came from multiple people handling the shroud over centuries, creating a mixed genetic signal that appears anomalous but actually represents contamination from many sources. The ancient population theory suggested the DNA genuinely represents an individual from an ancient population whose genetic profile was unusual, due to isolated breeding populations or genetic drift in ways we do not fully understand. The sample degradation theory proposed that the DNA is so degraded and damaged that the sequences being read are artifacts of degradation, not real genetic information. But each explanation had problems. Contamination should produce a random mixture, not consistent patterns. Ancient populations still should fit within known human genetic variation. Degradation should produce random errors, not systematic patterns. Schwortz admitted, "Every conventional explanation has serious weaknesses, which leaves us with an uncomfortable possibility that the DNA profile is genuine, and it represents someone whose genetic ancestry does not fit our current models of human population genetics." When Schwartz agreed to go public with the DNA findings in early 2024, he knew the announcement would be controversial. He had spent 46 years building credibility as an objective researcher who presented evidence without pushing religious conclusions. At 78 years old, having devoted nearly half a century to studying the Shroud, he felt a responsibility to share what had been discovered, even if it raised more questions than it answered. Schwartz stated in a video released in March 2024, "I went to Turin in 1978 as a skeptic. I am still, in many ways, a skeptic. I question everything. I demand evidence. I do not accept claims without data. But after 46 years of examining this cloth, documenting every test, and analyzing every piece of data, I can no longer maintain that the Shroud is easily explained as a medieval forgery. The image properties do not match any known artistic technique. The 1988 carbon dating has unresolved methodological questions. And now this DNA analysis suggests whoever's blood is on this cloth had a genetic profile that is genuinely anomalous. I am not telling you this is the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. I am not making religious claims. I am telling you that the scientific evidence, physical, chemical, and now genetic, does not fit conventional explanations. Something about this cloth is extraordinary. We need to be honest about that, even if it makes us uncomfortable." The response was immediate and divided. Christian communities, particularly those who had always believed in the Shroud's authenticity, celebrated the DNA findings as vindication. Headlines in religious media proclaimed that science had finally proved what faith always knew. But Barrie Schwortz pushed back. "This does not prove religious claims," he said. "It proves the Shroud is anomalous. Anomalous is not the same as miraculous. We need more research, better sampling, and independent replication. What we have is fascinating data that raises profound questions. We do not have definitive answers." The scientific community was more cautious. Several geneticists who had reviewed the data acknowledged it was unusual, but argued the sample size was too small and the contamination risks too high to draw firm conclusions. They called for new sampling from different areas of the cloth and for more rigorous contamination controls. Skeptics pointed out that anomalous DNA results from ancient samples are common and usually turn out to be artifacts of degradation, contamination, or analysis errors. They argued that without independent verification, the findings should be treated as preliminary at best, but nobody could explain away all of the Shroud's characteristics, the image properties remained unexplained. The formation mechanism remained unknown. The DNA added another layer of mystery. One historian noted that the shroud has been studied more intensively than almost any archaeological artifact, and after all that study, we still cannot definitively say what it is, when it was made, or how the image was created. That alone is remarkable. At 78, Barrie Schwortz finds himself in an unexpected position, a Jewish photographer who has become one of the world's foremost authorities on Christianity's most controversial relic. He says he never intended to spend his life on this. He thought it would be a 5-day photography job in 1978, maybe a few interesting pictures, then move on to the next assignment. Instead, it has become the defining work of his life. People ask him, "Do you believe it is real? Do you think it wrapped Jesus?" He answers that he does not approach it as a question of belief. He approaches it as a question of evidence. And the evidence is extraordinary. The image should not exist by any conventional explanation. The three-dimensional information, the photographic negative property, the superficial fiber discoloration with no pigments, these are not things medieval forgers could create. They are not things modern scientists can replicate, even with our advanced technology. And now this DNA analysis suggests genetic markers that do not fit standard population models. If it is real, and if it is not contamination or degradation artifacts, it means the person whose blood is on that cloth had an ancestry that challenges our understanding of human genetics. I am not saying it is miraculous. I am saying it is unexplained. The fact that it remains unexplained after decades of study by some of the world's best scientists shows how genuinely anomalous this object is. Schwortz has called for new research to address the outstanding questions. New carbon dating should sample from the center of the cloth, away from edges and repairs, using multiple dating methods to cross-validate results. Advanced DNA analysis should extract DNA from blood areas specifically, with rigorous contamination controls and sequence using the latest genomic technology. Image formation experiments should attempt to replicate all the shroud's image characteristics using various proposed mechanisms to determine which, if any, can produce matching results. Comprehensive chemical analysis should use modern analytical techniques that were not available in 1978 to characterize the image chemistry in detail. Schwortz noted, "We have the technology now to answer questions we could not answer in 1978, but it requires access to the shroud, which the custodians in Turin control, and it requires funding, which is difficult for research on controversial religious artifacts. The questions are too important to leave unanswered. Whether you are religious or not, whether you believe the shroud is authentic or not, an artifact that has these characteristics deserves serious scientific investigation." The implications of the new DNA findings extend far beyond the shroud itself. If the genetic sequences are genuine and represent an individual with an anomalous ancestry profile, it raises questions about human population genetics, ancient migrations, and genetic variation that we do not fully understand. If the DNA is degraded or contaminated in ways that produce false signals, it demonstrates the limitations of genetic analysis on ancient samples and should inform how we interpret other archaeological genetic data. And if the shroud is authentic, if it genuinely wrapped a crucified man in first-century Jerusalem, and if that man had a genetic profile that does not match standard human populations, then we are confronting questions about human history and identity that go beyond science into theology and philosophy. Schwartz admitted he does not have all the answers. After 46 years, I am comfortable saying that what I have is data. Data that is consistent, reproducible, and unexplained by conventional theories. The image exists. Its properties are measurable and anomalous. The blood-like stains show chemical characteristics consistent with real blood. And now the genetic analysis suggests an ancestry profile that does not fit our models. Whether that means it is the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, I cannot say. I am a photographer, not a theologian. But dismissing the shroud as an obvious medieval forgery is no longer scientifically defensible. The evidence does not support that conclusion. Something about this cloth is extraordinary. Christians, skeptics, and scientists all need to grapple with that reality. Barrie Schwortz's journey, from a skeptical photographer to one of the most dedicated researchers of the Shroud of Turin, shows what can happen when evidence is examined honestly. He didn't go in searching for proof of faith or trying to defend a belief. For him, it started as a straightforward photography assignment. But what he encountered didn't fit any normal explanation, and that's what kept him looking deeper. Now, decades later, the latest DNA findings have added a new layer to this already complex mystery. Tests revealed genetic markers that don't match known human population profiles. That raises difficult questions. Are these sequences genuine, pointing to an unknown or unusual ancestry? Or are they the result of contamination, degradation, or testing limitations? No one can say for certain yet. The debate is ongoing, and more research is needed. What's clear is that the shroud remains one of the most studied and debated artifacts in history. And Schwortz, who never planned to dedicate his life to a Christian relic, has become one of its most trusted voices. At 78, he knows his time is limited, but he's committed to continuing the search for answers. Not to prove or disprove religion, but simply to understand what this object really is. After 46 years, one thing stands out. We still don't fully understand it. The shroud has always surprised researchers, from the image analysis in 1978 to carbon dating in 1988, and now DNA results. It doesn't fit neatly into categories of real or fake. Instead, it challenges assumptions and forces a simple but powerful response. We don't know yet. And maybe that's the point.